Good morning. We'll try to get started. Thank you all very much for coming. And the fact that you're here so early, I know, is a testament to your affection, as well as mine, for Nathan and Rob and for Gabe. I will be a very hands-off moderator. You have their bios here. I think you're familiar with all of their work. And so we'll start out. Nathan will begin, and then Gaith will comment, and then Rob. And then hopefully we'll have ample time for questions. So please, Nathan.
Thank you very much. I mean, what I'm going to talk about is really the piece that you have in front of you. They call the Plan B, and the details are in there, and I won't go over all of them. What I thought I would do would be to just give you an overview first, kind of why I'm writing this piece. Second, talk a little bit about why I don't think a two-state solution, pushing for a two-state solution now, makes much sense. Third, look at the alternative approach that we've been trying. I shouldn't say the alternative approach, but the approach that we've been trying to realize diplomatic progress, the West Bank first approach, and why I'm not optimistic about that. Fourth, talk a little bit about my alternative. And fifth, just say a few words about the emerging approach of the Obama administration. Okay, can I be heard? Or great, okay. First, why did I write it? And I've got to admit here, I wrote it because some friends of mine, people I respect, one of them actually is here, Larry Garber, I was having lunch with, I think, a couple months ago, somebody else, and they were saying, Nathan, you know, everything you write makes sense, but it just gets gloomier and gloomier and gloomier. Don't you have anything constructive to say? And my answer at the time was no. But I took that as a challenge. Do I have anything constructive to offer? I had a sense of that what we were watching was a train wreck in slow motion, and that could be described, but I wasn't quite sure how to treat it. What was worse than simply the events at which I saw as a deterioration in the status quo, but also sort of a nasty habit, I think, of American diplomacy of essentially treating the situation on the ground right now as if it was a situation 2 or 3 years ago and pursuing solutions that would have made sense long after their expiration date. So let me move from that, after telling you here I'm going to be positive, to start off with, you know, what I perhaps is what's in my head rather than my heart, the negative. Is a two-state solution possible? Is moving towards a two-state solution possible now? And the answer there, I think, is simply no. We've been banging our heads against this for quite some time, explicitly since 2002 in the Bush administration. You could argue implicitly during the whole Oslo process. And the problems right now don't need to be belabored. You've got an incoming Israeli leadership that doesn't seem to explicitly buy into it, and certainly doesn't, even if they did buy into it, doesn't buy into the sorts of concessions that it would entail. You've got a deeply entrenched settler population on the West Bank. Those two things are not new. We've dealt with those before. But what we're also dealing with now is a deeply split and fragmented Palestinian community. There's simply nobody that can negotiate authoritatively for the Palestinians right now. There just isn't. And, you know, of course, there's nobody on the Palestinian side to talk to is an old mantra of the critics of the peace camp in Israel. And in a sense, I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They have some responsibility for bringing that situation about, but that's a situation that exists right now. And so what happens when you pursue a two-state solution is as Bush administration showed, you set diplomatic wheels in motion that sort of devalue the process. I'm not sure that people actually on the ground take the process all that seriously right now, and the solution itself begins to lose some credibility. The second, what about this West Bank first approach, which is the approach that the Bush administration followed since the events of Gaza, June 2007, and which I see and I'll talk about this a little bit briefly at the end, the Obama administration picking up on. The problems with that, I mean, the basic argument is as it's articulated, is let's build up the Palestinian Authority and show that it can work with economic progress, with security progress, and perhaps with some kind of meaningful diplomatic process, and we'll show the people of Gaza that Hamas is not delivering anything. I think there are all kinds of practical problems associated with that, but it's predicated, by the way, on something that I think is misstating the problem. It's not the Palestinian Authority versus Hamas. Hamas views itself as a legitimate Palestinian Authority government. We don't have to buy into that, but what that means is that when we're dealing with Gaza, you're not dealing with an actor that sees itself as or is necessarily regarded in Palestinian society as some sort of rogue actor, but as the established government. And so it's half of the Palestinian Authority. And so what we're doing is dealing with basically taking sides in a Palestinian civil war. We're taking the side that I think we find easier to deal with for all kinds of reasons, but it doesn't speak authoritatively for the Palestinian Authority. And in fact, what it has the effect of doing is creating what I've referred to as sort of an international protectorate on the West Bank, something that is able to deliver some kinds of modest improvements in some economic and security affairs, but really isn't experienced by Palestinians as their government or one that is responsive to them. So what's the alternative that I'm offering here? Well, essentially what I start with is realities on the ground. There is a meaningful diplomatic process that's going on. In a sense, there are two. There's an intra-Palestinian one about moving towards some kind of national reconciliation, and there's Israeli-Palestinian negotiations about a ceasefire that were active for a while that seem to have gone slightly into hibernation. And my basic argument is that we should take the diplomatic process that exists rather than the ones that rather than trying to create one which doesn't have much of a basis right now, and move towards a very effective ceasefire, one that is not like the one that existed in June of 2008 that broke down so spectacularly. I'm not going to talk about the problems of that ceasefire and what has to be done to correct it, but what I would refer you to is the International Crisis Group report at the end of December that really, I think, analyzed the problems in that much more effectively, the old ceasefire, and what a proper ceasefire has to look like much more effectively than I ever could. But ceasefire to what end? I mean, it's good to get people to stop hurting each other, but then what? And what I'm arguing here is that it may make sense if we can't move to a two-state solution, at least in the short or perhaps even in the medium term, we can take that ceasefire and turn it into something a little bit more enduring, what I'm calling an armistice. One that would offer both sides something that they desperately need. What it would offer Hamas would be the ability to essentially build up their party state in Gaza. Something that exists right now that all sorts of international efforts and Israeli efforts, military, economic, diplomatic, have not been able to dislodge, and essentially, I guess, learning to live with that. It would offer Hamas that, and offering Israel some peace and quiet, and one that, if Hamas signed on to, would probably be enforced not simply on Hamas but on all the other Palestinian factions as well. That's, the attraction, but would have to address a major Israeli concern, and that is that Hamas would use it not simply to build itself up internally, but to build itself up militarily. It would have to be coupled to be attractive to Israel with some kind of meaningful steps taken against Hamas arming itself. This would be difficult. I'm not sure. I mean, Hamas has basically said point blank, we're not interested. We have the right to get whatever weapons we want. And I think it would be difficult to prevent Israel from taking its own sorts of unilateral actions in order to entrench its positions more deeply and to sort of tilt the status quo in its directions to create facts in the famous phrase. But that's what international diplomacy should concentrate on. And if that is successful, that the calm used by the ceasefire sort of morphing into an armistice could be used to rebuild Palestinian institutions on the ground. I think a Palestinian National Unity government is a good idea in the short term. In the long term, I think it's a bad idea because it leads to paralysis. So it's got to be a government that paves the way towards meaningful possibilities of rotation in power. And let me just say that, we're now in March of 2009. Okay? Palestinian elections would have been due next January. For the certainly for the parliament, the presidential election is more controversial, but they were due either last January or this coming January. Had we stuck with a policy of essentially holding the Palestinian Authority together back when Hamas won the elections in 2006, they would be facing the voters very soon with not an awful lot to show for it. Right now, there's no meaningful prospect of Palestinian elections unless there is some sort of Palestinian reconciliation. And I don't see any way to dislodge or change Hamas's viewpoint without holding in front of them the prospect of losing at the polls. That's been the only thing that's kind of changed their conduct in the past. So that's the approach that I'm advocating. Is that the approach that the Obama administration seems to be taking? The short answer is no. Right now, what I would say, and just a few words, sort of observations on what I see as the emerging approach of the new administration, there are two important changes that exist from the Bush approach. Number one, they're repeating like a mantra, we have to take a regional approach. And what that means, at least in the short term, is much more engagement in regional diplomacy and in regional actors. And there's some successful and impressive efforts in that regard. And a second, a willingness to go toe-to-toe with the Israeli government, especially on the issue of settlements. There's some indications there that that's where they're going. Those two things would mark a difference in important qualitative differences from the Bush approach. Those aside, however, what I think they offer is essentially a more muscular and I hate to put it this way, but I will, a more competent version of the approach that the Bush administration took in the last couple of years. In very important elements, I see not change but continuity. Attitude towards a national unity government. And in a sense, there's some, if anything, a slight amount of backsliding there that the United States has offered a few formulations, but is basically extremely insistent on the quartet conditions. And one of the formulations is not simply that a Palestinian National Unity government has to subscribe to the quartet conditions, but that Hamas itself as a movement has to subscribe explicitly to the quartet conditions. They will not do so. So if that's the path that we follow, we have to do so knowing that that will be the result. There doesn't seem to be that much interest that I can detect in the ceasefire between Israelis and Palestinians. If there is activity on that regard, American activity, it's invisible to me. So I think what we're seeing, as I say, is in a sense a couple welcome changes. Probably a more competent use of diplomacy and a willingness to deal with our friends as well as our adversaries when they do things that undermine the American project. But overall, I see a continuity and in Obama administration policy, and my hunch is it's likely to come to similar results.
Thank you, Nathan. Very insightful. Raid, why don't you go?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, first of all, it's a very provocative, challenging, and I think very timely piece. It's not an easy one. It was not an easy one for me to read, really, because it intelligently challenges some of the orthodoxies, some of the things that I have, held as a belief for a long time and I actually continue to believe in. But what it does is really shows the very tough questions facing us and the inherent uncertainty in the policy options that we have right now. Whether we go towards isolating Hamas, engaging Hamas, there is no certainty. Really, there are no precedents that we can build on. So I guess this defines much of the debate that we need right now. But the fact that this paper is on the table right now, it offers us a chance to engage in this necessary debate. I agree definitely with the need for an immediate ceasefire. It's essential for many reasons. I think the results of the Gaza war showed not only the human aspects, but also the political implications of continued volatility in the security situation between Gaza and the West Bank. And I also agree that a peace deal is not achievable in the short term, and we do need to find medium-term stabilization arrangements if we want to move forward on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. However, I do have issues with the proposed armistice or the proposed kind of long-term or 10-year armistice between the Palestinians and the Israelis as it is presented in this paper. To me, it sounds very much like Oslo on steroids. It looks like what Oslo should have looked like 15 years ago. I think it could have worked had we, had Oslo been approached in this way 15 years ago. I think it's a little bit too late. It basically talks about finding an interim arrangement, but dealing with the two major aspects of instability or sources of instability in Palestinian-Israeli relations. In particular, a settlement freeze on the Israeli side and control of armament on the Palestinian side. I really have two major issues with this approach. One relates to sustainability. I think settlement freeze on the one hand, or settlement expansion rather on the one hand, and the ongoing violence are natural and unavoidable products of the continued occupation. As long as we have the occupation, as long as we have the conflict, these issues, the issue of settlement expansion and the issue of armament, could be controlled for a short time, but they cannot be maintained and sustained for a long period. So the way I look at them as tools that we might use for medium-term stabilization in order to achieve another goal. But on their own, I don't think they are sustainable. I cannot see the Israeli political system, which in 10 years probably will have 3 or 4 elections, I cannot see it sustaining a settlement freeze. The issue of settlement freeze will continue popping up in every turn. And so while it could work during the life of one Israeli administration, I don't see it as achievable on the longer term. The other issue that I actually have with the paper, besides the issue of sustainability, is the issue of who is the partner on the Palestinian side. And I think this is a bit where the paper is not very clear, and I think this is the major issue that we're facing right now. One thing for sure, we cannot, in my view, have two Palestinian addresses as we try to move the process forward. We cannot deal with two Palestinian partners who have totally different platforms and totally different obligations. I cannot see a situation, or it's a very complicated situation for the international community, be it the US or be it others, to engage with the PA on the one hand, based on the Oslo framework and the previous agreements and obligations, and on the other hand, deal with Hamas based on a completely other set of criteria. This creates complications which I believe are completely unmanageable. One of the problems that I have with the paper is that it really seems to kind of reverse the Bush approach without really dealing with the fundamental problems with it. More specifically, during the Bush administration, I think most of the effort was put in trying to destroy Hamas, weaken Hamas, eliminate Hamas, and very little effort, if any, was put in trying to really shore up the other players on the Palestinian side. If you look at the Bush objectives of improving economy and improving quality of life and making progress on the diplomatic process, none of that none of that succeeded, simply because I think not enough effort and not enough competence was put in that direction. What the new approach that Nathan is proposing is doing the exact opposite. It's proposing that we put all and most of the diplomatic and other kind of effort into bringing Hamas in, with very little mention of what we can do to support those on the Palestinian side who actually agree with us and who fit within our view of policy in that region. So I think it's a mistake to completely ignore the interests of the PLO, the interests of the PA, and focus only on bringing in Hamas. And I found this actually quite striking when I was reading the paper, that as it tries to deal with the interests and concerns of Israel and Hamas, there's almost no mention of the interests and concerns of the PLO. And whether or not, and yes, the PLO right now and the PA are in a weaker political position, but they continue to be a major political player in the Palestinian side, and I think that has to be taken into account. So if we cannot have two Palestinian addresses. And if, as the paper proposes, that the PA is no longer really a viable political address, or the PLO or Fatah, or name it what you will, what about Hamas? Can we bring them in? I think, first of all, rewarding Hamas for its use of violence seems to me to be a very unhelpful approach. Just because Hamas is able to be a spoiler doesn't mean that it has to be rewarded politically for that. Yes, its ability to be a spoiler have to be controlled. Yes, there has to be a graduated process of bringing them into the mainstream. However, to simply go and give Hamas political gains, be it a settlement freeze, be it an opening of Gaza, or of these things, just simply because the fact that they can use violence to achieve their goals and to subvert a process, I think might be counterproductive, and it sends the wrong message. One thing that the paper mentions in terms of advocating diplomatic openness to Hamas, or opening to Hamas, is that Hamas is already legitimate. It's a fact of life that Hamas does not need international legitimation for it to continue to exist, or to continue to see itself as legitimate. It's true. The source of Hamas' legitimacy is not international recognition. It is domestic, and it's a bit more regional. But diplomatic recognition still is the most jarring deficit in Hamas' legitimacy. For Hamas to become a completely accepted player and a completely accepted leader of the Palestinian movement, they need this international legitimacy. And this, I think, gives the international community quite a lot of leverage when it comes to Hamas. And I think it's an asset that should not be squandered lightly. I don't think that the international community engaging Hamas at this stage would bring us much benefits. There's nothing that Europe or the United States can bring to the table vis-a-vis Hamas at this stage that others cannot bring. And I believe, and I think one point that Nathan makes in the paper, that the bottom line of Hamas has to be explored and has to be discovered. I think this is absolutely true. Hamas, so far, has not had to deal with the real issues, in terms of some of the real issues, because they were never really tested. But I think that the testing should not be done by the US or by Europe, by the Western world. It should continue to be done by those parties that have relations with Hamas. I think Egypt in particular is best placed to do this, to see how far Hamas is willing. And if we see movement on Hamas' side, this is when we can start bringing in Western interlocutors. But right now, to break the diplomatic isolation of Hamas, without Hamas moving anywhere, without Hamas paying a political price for that, I think would be politically unwise. And as I said, I think Egypt can continue to play the role of exploring how far Hamas needs to go. One point that I agree with very strongly in the paper is regarding Palestinian unity. It is desirable, but it's not an end in itself. It's not the goal. The goal is not unity and power sharing, but rather the goal is creating the conditions for an election or for a transfer of power. I think that Hamas and Fatah and Hamas and the PLO have no real common grounds between them. There is a different domestic ideology, there's a different foreign policy ideology, and as such, I really don't see the grounds for unity, and any unity would be terribly superficial, as we saw in previous arrangements. One caveat here, though, that unity, in order to deal with unity, one aspect that was, I think, dismissed in the paper, but I think is quite fundamental, is the issue of security within the Palestinian political system. I think effort to reform the security sector in a way that makes it non-partisan, that makes it professional, that makes it, that gives a very clear mission, constitutional mission, is an essential prerequisite. Unity, or even the concept of having an election, while Fatah and Hamas continue to have their militias, can never be sustainable. Because whichever party does not like the outcome of the political process can easily invalidate it through using violence. I believe, actually, that we don't really need a new approach to the Palestinian-Israeli peacemaking. I think that the old approach that we had is theoretically sound. I think the problem that we had so far has been very much a problem of incompetence in application. And I think that the Obama administration, rather than trying to radically reinvent a new approach that would endanger some of the other interests in the region, I think what we should do is have a more vigorous attempt to implement an architecture which basically deals with two parallel tracks. One track is continuing with a diplomatic process, knowing very well that we cannot have a result in the short term, but at least the diplomatic process will create the framework in which other progress happens. And in the meantime, continuing with progress on the ground while encouraging a Palestinian unity on terms which are internationally acceptable. And engaging the international community and the diplomatic community in a way that makes use of the texture in the diplomatic world. One of the problems of the Bush administration was, deciding to take the lead on everything and shutting all of the other players out of the process. I think other players, be it Arab players, be it some European players, have something to add and can go more than the U.S. Can go. But still, I don't believe that we have to reverse the whole diplomatic approach. And I think I will leave it at this.
Thanks, Khalid. Please, Rob.
Good morning, and do I have to press this? This is fine. No, that's okay. Good morning, and thanks for having me, and thanks really for an opportunity to comment on Nathan's piece. I think Brown's pieces, all of them, are always thought-provoking, always lucidly written, and I find them among the best that we could read on this topic all around. So thanks again for another great contribution. As I listen to this discussion, and as I think of how you opened in your conversation with Larry Garber about why we all become naysayers, it's true that for so many of us who have had this dream of partitioning, historic mandatory Palestine and having two states, these are days, to paraphrase Barney Frank, of post-partition depression, where it seems like so many who've been who have invested so much in the peacemaking two-state solution. I find when we talk to them, they are really bereft of ideas, and maybe it is time. I'm not sure it's time to come up with Plan B, but it's certainly time to question Plan A and to think about turning the page not just on the 8 years of the Bush administration, but all the years that have preceded them since Oslo, because all those years have yielded very little in terms of success, whether it's for the Israeli people or for the Palestinian people. A few words on Nathan's proposal, what he calls Plan B. As I said, I think it is time to think in new and creative ways. I'm not sure that you have found that way yet, because a lot of the issues that Raith mentioned, and which are obstacles in front of your long-term armistice, are probably as formidable as the obstacles in front of a two-state solution. A settlement freeze is one. The term with settlement freeze, which we've called for many years, but seems to be impossible for many reasons, some justifiable. I mean, settlements are a living entity, and so if you actually have the settlements, it's very hard to freeze. You're going to have to dismantle them before you're actually going to be able to tackle the problem. But also because any Israeli government has more than one means at its disposal to continue the settlements, whether it's through natural growth or whether it's through continuing them in the existing areas or making exceptions for East Jerusalem. This is not a battle, I think, that a U.S. administration could on which it can prevail in the long run. Then there's the issue of what an armistice would really look like, which your paper begins to tackle, but it's hard to find. How are you going to find common ground between the Israeli position and Hamas's position in terms of Israeli withdrawal? From where? Is it the West Bank, when in fact Hamas is only in control of Gaza? Is it, and what amount of the West Bank? Who is the interlocutor on the Palestinian side? Why would the Israelis agree to withdraw from territory in exchange simply for 5 to 10 year armistice? I think all these questions are ones that deserve being further explored. I don't think we have found the answer yet. I think it's further validation of the view that we are at the end of an era, but I don't think we know what the next era is. So rather than focusing on what the solution is, I think what the most productive thing that we can do is reflect on three questions. What's wrong with the peace process? Three simple questions. What's wrong with the peace process? What's wrong with bilateral negotiations? And what's wrong with us? And by us, I mean the U.S. What's wrong with the peace process is really what Nathan described so lucidly in his piece. Why is it that everything that has been tried under so many configurations, some of the best configurations when you had strong Palestinian and Israeli leaders, or when you have, as of now, or at least in the recent years, Palestinians and Israeli leaders who seemed committed to a two-state solution, when you have broad international consensus, in fact, wall-to-wall consensus of a type that has never existed before, in favor of a two-state solution. When Israeli leaders recognize that without a two-state solution, it's their own future as a Jewish democratic state that's in peril, and Arab states, pro-Western Sunni Arab states that recognize that without a two-state solution, their own credibility as leaders in the face of a wave of radicalism is in jeopardy. Why is it that throughout those years we have never been able, despite multiple efforts, which one could criticize on the margins here and there, but nonetheless, the main message is whatever we've tried in terms of a peace process has failed. Second, and I think that demands that we think again about what the objectives of that peace process were, and this is why ideas like a long-term armistice need to be part of the equation. I'm not sure they're the answer, but why is it that the 15-year search for a two-state solution has come to naught? Is it something about the solution itself? Is it something about trying to end the conflict, as it's been stated, that is simply not possible under today, and maybe we have to look for something different? A long-term arrangement where the Palestinians have their state, the occupation comes to an end, but some of the more existential issues haven't been resolved. I don't have the answer. Again, I just think these are things that are worth considering before simply repeating the processes of the past. The second question, what's wrong with bilateral negotiations? Why is it, if you think about it, that the most significant changes that have occurred on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians have occurred as a result not of bilateral agreements, but unilateral steps? Obviously, the unilateral disengagement from Gaza, which can be criticized, but I would say the criticism shouldn't derive from the fact that it was a disengagement, not because it was unilateral, but because of what happened afterwards. The fact that Gaza was not able to govern itself, the attitude, the conduct, behavior vis-a-vis the Hamas authorities, the siege that was put on Gaza, all of that has led to, and Hamas's own less than mature attitude when it won the elections, that's contributed to the failure of the Gaza disengagement. As I said, not the fact that it wasn't the disengagement, and I would argue not so much the fact that it was unilateral. It could have succeeded despite that. The second event that we're seeing that has more or less succeeded, although also has come to an end, are the ceasefires, which the recent ceasefire were also unilateral steps by Hamas and by Israel. So what is it about the negotiations between those two parties that simply does not yield results that are meaningful and sustainable on the ground? Is it the asymmetry between the two? What does this mean in terms of the need to bring other actors in, whether they're European, Arab, or others? What does it say in the end about the capacity of Israelis and Palestinians? If you put them into a room and you say, now you're going to negotiate this final agreement, can they actually do it? Is that something that is conceivable, or do we need to think of other modes of negotiation? And finally, what's wrong with us? It's also striking when you look at the history of the peace process how little the U.S. has been able to shape events from the outset. Almost all of the meaningful steps between Israelis and Palestinians have been initiated by them without us in the room, or often without us knowing about them. Certainly that was the case of Anwar Sadat's trip to Jerusalem. It was the case of the Oslo Agreement. It was the case of the Israeli-Jordanian Agreement. It was the case, to the extent this is one could consider it successful, of the more recent Israeli-Syrian talks initiated by Turkey. I'm convinced the U.S. is a critical player when it's going to come to conclude agreements, when it's going to come to convince the parties that they can take the risks to cross the last step. But what is it about the United States that has made it so ineffective in initiating successful processes? And I think, again, that's a question that this administration and all of us need to think about. And I suspect that it has something to do with the fact that when the parties are in the presence of the U.S. becomes much more of a player and a party that they're trying to influence, and at the expense of their own bilateral conversation. So as I said, I think Nathan's piece is an extremely insightful point of departure about where we are today. And I wouldn't change a word to what he said about the problem with a two-state solution, the problem about Palestinian divisions, about Israeli fragmentation. I would add to it the fact that Palestinians have begun to lose a sense of why the two-state solution is so important to them. The way we're talking about it, the way the last administration and this one is talking about it, the two-state solution seems like a favor to Israel, a gift to the U.S., a gift to Sunni moderate pro-Western Arab states. But the Palestinians seem to be the last beneficiaries in all this, and I suspect many of them are beginning to think that this is all being done not for them, but to them, and in favor of other parties. I think that's another factor that's behind this disillusionment with the two-state solution, and I suspect on the Israeli side as well. This doesn't seem to be addressing their interests or their aspirations. It seems to be part of a broader geopolitical game, which has very little to do with their everyday lives. I would add another factor. I would add to the reason why we're in such a sorry state is the regional polarization, which makes it much harder to get the kind of consensus and regional quiet that you would need to move on such a delicate matter. Two other points, one about Hamas and one about the Obama administration. I don't know. I've never assumed that Hamas can be converted and brought into the process simply by virtue of talking to it. I never have even argued that the U.S. administration should talk to it. I've argued that others should. I've argued that we should at least try to explore the possibility through a diplomatic process of shaping it and influencing it and playing on the fact that there are different actors who may have different interests within the organization. And I've argued against a policy which, in my view, has shown time and time again not only its failures but the cost of those failures, which is a policy that says we're going to boycott. We're going, again, the arguments that Nathan makes, we're going to boycott, we're going to put Gaza under siege, and we're going to hope that over time Gaza will be, Hamas will grow weaker and Fatah will go stronger. This is a perennial argument that my friend Reith and I have had, where I think I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the notion is that we can't afford 2 years ago to bring Hamas in and to engage it because you needed to have a balance of power in which Fatah was stronger, Abbas and the PA was stronger, and Hamas was weaker, and so you could use the ensuing period to shift that balance of power. But if anything, the trends have gone in opposite directions. Fatah is more discredited, the PA is more discredited. I'm not sure that Hamas has gained popularity domestically, it's gained it regionally, and it certainly has entrenched its position in Gaza. And so I don't know how waiting longer before trying to bring them in, again, not necessarily through U.S. engagement, but trying to bring them in, how waiting any longer and not, it would be a successful option. I think our goal right now, the goal should be to insist on the most important things, the most meaningful steps that Hamas could take if it were brought in a government. One is a commitment to ceasefire. That takes more than Hamas. It means Israel, too, has to agree to the terms of the ceasefire. As Nathan says, that ceasefire has to be much more solid than the one that existed before. And second of all, renew Hamas's commitment that if there were a peace process of any kind, and again, I'm saying we're going to have to revisit what the goals of that peace process are and its instruments, but if there were a peace process, Hamas would agree that it would abide by the results of any referendum, any national Palestinian referendum, on whatever putative agreement might emerge. I think that's what's important. Because if you have those two things, you have the quiet, and you have a process through which the Palestinians can agree and accept an accord with Israel. All the other conditions of the quartet, frankly, I'm not sure what they would add to this. So Hamas recognizes Israel, which it won't do. But even if it did, what really matters is whether it would accept a popular verdict on an agreement. It renounces violence. It won't do that either. But even if it signed a piece of paper, is that more meaningful than actually implementing on the ground a ceasefire? So I've always thought that we should put Hamas in the front of much more. They are an easier bar for it to meet. I don't think it's easy by any means, but an easier bar for it to meet, but also one that would be much more meaningful both for the Palestinians and for the Israelis. And I think we have to revisit that approach to Hamas. I think what we're doing now is certainly not going to lead to a more stable situation or to a more successful peace process. Finally, on the Obama administration. Nathan, again, who's managed to surpass me in my pessimism, which makes me feel much better today, I think has reached conclusions which one could reach on the basis of what we've seen. I'm not sure. I do think there's a risk that because the Bush administration has left a doubly harmful legacy It did the wrong things poorly, which creates the illusion that somehow they can be done well. They can't. And I do have that fear that we're going to see the Obama administration believing somehow that by, in fact, helping Abu Mazen in a way he wasn't, in fact, having a peace process that's more energetic than the one that existed, and by being more effective on the regional field, that you could succeed where the Bush administration failed. I couldn't agree more with Nathan. That won't work. I'm not sure that's where we'll be. I think that you could read different signs, because I think if you want to have a successful peace process, first of all, you are going to have a different regional climate. I think the administration is working on that when it comes to Syria, and sooner or later when it comes to Iran. I think if you're going to have the successful process, you're going to have a different attitude towards domestic Palestinian politics. We don't see that yet, and I suspect that the administration is not going to shift at all when it comes to Hamas per se. I could imagine the administration taking a different line when it comes to the government and saying, well, government we will judge on the basis of its actions. The government we will judge, we won't deal with its Hamas members, but we will judge the government itself on the basis of whether it's committed to a ceasefire and committed to the kind of process that I described. At least I think the jury is still out on how it will take that approach. And we know at a minimum that we've gone from a faith-based administration to a reality-based one. And so even if they begin on one road, I suspect they may deviate if they see that doesn't succeed. The one thing I think, again, I think we all three would agree on this. Certainly Nathan would agree that continuing the process of the past, whether it has to do with the two-state solution, and whether it has to do with our approach to Hamas or the region, that can't succeed, even, as I said, if it's done better. I mean, it brings to mind the saying of Thomas Edison, who said, I haven't failed, I've just discovered 1,000 ways that didn't succeed. Well, we have failed, and all the ways that we've tried haven't succeeded. And I think it really is time now, whether it's for Plan B, C, or D, to take a very hard look at what hasn't worked and try to find another way and put all the sacred cows on the table, whether it is the search for a two-state solution, whether it is for an end-of-conflict agreement, whether it is for an armistice, whether it is bring Hamas in, because time is short, and I think we do have an opportunity now with a new administration and a region that seems to be about as much as a loss as all three of us are, to take stock, to take time, and to come up with something that might succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Very elegantly put, as always. Nathan, I know you probably want to respond to Reith and Rob, but why don't we bundle a couple questions, and then you can also respond to them as well. So please, wait for the microphone.
My name is Tamam Al-Barazi from Al-Watan Al-Arabi magazine. Yesterday, Abu Mazen, criticized heavily Iran, the regional player, and he said he called it to stop interfering in its affair. Two speakers talk about regional equation in the peace process. Do you think that Iran and Syria, what they want from this? How they can play constructive on the Palestinian side?
Thank you. Why don't we take? Please.
Thanks to each of you for what I thought were very good presentations. I guess I'd like to pursue the issue of the potential for a national unity government, and you sort of threw it out there, but you didn't really get into whether you think it's likely to happen, some type of reconciliation leading to a national unity government, and then what you think the reaction would be of the U.S. and Israel to this national unity government. I think Rob was going a little bit in this direction, but even you didn't finish off the thought. Would that change the dynamic of the ability to somehow have the U.S. Dealing with Hamas indirectly, or accepting Hamas as part of something? And then what would be the likely reaction from your perspective of the National Unity Government agreement calling for elections at some point in the near future? Would this again be treated as a positive development by the U.S.? Should it be treated as a positive development by the U.S. And then somewhat separately, none of you mentioned, and again, maybe this is from where I used to sit that I preoccupy about this, but none of you mentioned, again, the role of the U.S. in terms of continuing to provide huge amounts of assistance to the Palestinians. And the question is, and particularly in light of the recent conference in the Sharm el-Sheikh and Secretary Clinton's speech at the conference, in which she mentioned, at least rhetorically, that the importance of not using the assistance simply to address the short-term needs is how can the assistance program, which is still quite significant, be used in some way or be incorporated into a longer-term political strategy as opposed to simply addressing the immediate humanitarian needs in Palestine.
Thanks. Why don't we take one more question from a female, please? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much, everyone. And I have a question regarding this whole issue of changing democracy, so to speak, in a conflict. Whereas you mentioned on Israel, you never know who's going to come into power after an election. So any peace agreement that is made can obviously be at the will of the new government. And the same thing on the Palestinian side. And so also, what strategies can you suggest for smaller parties on the Palestinian side, which are trying to sort of become a player, but which are obviously always sort of pushed onto the sidelines by the bigger Hamas and Fatah? And how can they really make a name for themselves and be considered as serious players also in the international realm and also on the ground? Thanks.
Okay, why don't you guys grapple with those? And I would just add on to that about the unity government, Palestinian unity government. If you could just comment about Marwan Barghouti, would be great, and well, all of you, what you think about his possible release from prison. You want to start,
Nate? Thank you very much. I mean, these were great commentaries or discussants, and basically the lesson I take away is that I'm at my most persuasive when I'm being my most pessimistic. And maybe I should just stop trying to be optimistic about something. And there are some good questions, too. Let me just handle a couple issues that came up in the discussion. I can't respond to most of them, and sometimes I can't respond to most of them, partly in the interest of time and partly because the criticisms were sometimes quite persuasive. And therefore, I'd like to change the subject rather than to address them. But let me just talk about a couple things that came up. In terms of Raif's argument that description of the Bush administration policy, I think that was accurate towards the sort of West Bank first, and Rob's uncharitable description of it. Bad policy pursued badly, and Raif thinks it was a good policy pursued badly. I'm probably closer to Rob on that, but the point is it was pursued badly. There was an emphasis on those things that probably mattered least, including a real emphasis on security services, which in a sense contributed to the events of June 2007. Even before the split, contributed to the split itself. I think we have to realize that there actually is going to be a trade-off here that didn't come up in any of our comments that I just want to highlight. Raif is right that security services have to be on the table in any kind of reconstruction of the Palestinian Authority on some kind of professional basis. And that will mean that will have costs. That will have costs for Israel, which I think sees to the extent that they're willing to cooperate with Palestinian security reform, the security they're talking about is their own. Quite logically, that's what they care about the most. You sort of take them out of the political equation. In the long term, that's good. In the short term, that's going to have some cost. A comment also. And a comment, not a disagreement, about sort of the discussion here with Hamas. I think the way that all three of us have approached this is the way to approach it. The issue that is often framed here is, should we engage Hamas? And my answer is I don't really care. That's not the question I'm asking. And I think I come closest to Rob here, but I hear elements of what of my position in what Keith has to say. The real question is, what do we do about a national unity government? What do we do when the Egyptians talk to Hamas? The right interlocutors are probably the Egyptians. They're nasty. They twist arms. And so on, but they probably are the right interlocutors. The Europeans can play a role here. Whether or not we sit down at the table with Hamas is a secondary question that we should not waste all of our time and attention over. And it's a way of deflecting attention from what I think are the real issues. Larry, you had several good questions. I'm going to concentrate on the national unity government. Is it likely, and what is the U.S. attitude? That's the same question to me. It's likely if the U.S. Gives it a yellow light. And if the international community weighs in heavily. I think both sides, and I'm talking here Fatah and Hamas, have reasons to fear a national unity government. There are things that it would cost both sides. There are things that might get them, but it's a risky move for both sides. And in a sense, they have to be persuaded to do it. And the persuasion is where the international actors can come in. The Egyptians with their heavy-handed methods. The Americans have heavy-handed methods. The Israelis have heavy-handed methods to sort of change the equation. Things like, essentially, the population of Gaza is held hostage to these negotiations. It's not the way that I like to see negotiations carried out, but what it means is that there are real cards that other actors have to play. So with the right international conditions, you could change the configuration of those negotiations. What I see so far is two sides that are, number one, anxious not to be on the wrong side of this issue domestically, right? The split is deeply unpopular among Palestinians. They don't have a state. All they've got is national unity, and then they lost that. So neither Hamas nor Fatah wants to be on the wrong side of that. Neither wants to be on the wrong side of Arab diplomacy, because that has real costs. And international diplomacy outside of the Arab world has some role to play. So if the United States gets behind it or says this is something that we could move forward with, then I think it's likely to happen. And here's the one place where I probably disagree with Rob. Maybe he's right that the Obama administration's we haven't seen the Obama administration's policies, but I thought I heard a door slammed repeatedly, over and over, deliberately by our Secretary of State. If I was missing something, then I'd like to be enlightened. The question about how aid can be used to support the politics, I think, kind of reverses the question. You use aid to support the politics. I'm summarizing your question probably unfairly. The aid won't do any good. You'll get humanitarian assistance, and people in Gaza won't starve to death, and there'll be malnutrition. They won't starve to death. There'll be medical supplies. That's what you'll get. You've got to get the politics right first. If you're going to do any sorts of things, you've got to be able to get materials in and out of Gaza. You've got to deal with the fact that Hamas rules Gaza. So without addressing the political conditions first, all you've got is an emergency assistance program for humanitarian aid. You've got to put the politics first if you really want to do anything reconstruction. But in terms of the small parties, let me just say this: they don't have a lot of role to play, but they do have some. In the agreement about the national unity government, in a sense, they can play a little bit of a conscience role. Sort of, we're speaking for, if they all line up on the same side. They don't. But if they all line up on the same side, in a sense, they can lend legitimacy. And Fatah and Hamas like to play this kind of propaganda game. It's kind of, we represent most of the Palestinian side, and then there's Hamas, or and then there's Fatah. So, and they can get involved in that game, kind of tilting the balance slightly. And the second thing that I would say is that these political parties are weak shells, and they could stop worrying about the role that they play today and tomorrow, and start worrying about the role that they're going to play 5 to 10 years from now, because that's, I think, the horizon they will have to have. And finally, with Karim's question about Marwan Barghouti, I'll leave that probably to more to Keith and and to Rob, except to say that that's another great idea whose time may have passed. And I won't explain why. I'll let them either agree or disagree.
Yeah. Okay. On Tamam's question, Iran and Syria. I mean, I think one of the unfortunate results of the Palestinian split, Palestinian lack of unity, is the fact that the door has become very open to outside influences. And I think we can criticize Arafat's legacy on many things, but one thing that he was always adept at was the ability to navigate and not be beholden to any regional or international player. I think the split has invited in other players. Syria and Iran have their own agendas. Iran in particular is playing a longer game. I think Syria's game is shorter term. I think Syria can be made to play a positive role if it gets what it wants in the short term through a peace process with Israel and through normalization with the U.S. Iran is a much more complicated player. In terms of small parties, I agree with Nathan. I just don't see a role for them. Maybe there will be a role for them in a future Palestinian polity, where the issues are more diverse and there's more political questions, more day-to-day political questions among Palestinians. Right now, the questions are really primarily about how do we deal with the peace process, how do we deal with the issue of liberation. There's the issue of governance, which is, in my view, quite secondary, but that's that. But the smaller parties do not have a role to play at this stage, and they're anyways too weak. Even if they had a theoretical role to play, they're still too weak. The society there is very divided between the two players, between Hamas and Fatah. The issue of Marwan. I don't think Marwan was ever, actually, here, I agree with, ever such a bright idea. I mean, Marwan, in my view, can be a very useful political tool on the short term. When Marwan is released, it will create enthusiasm, euphoria, inject energy for a month or two. The question is, what do you do with this energy? And my concern, if Marwan is released randomly in an ad hoc manner, we'll get these 2 months of excitement and then nothing will go. Marwan's release has to be part of a larger effort to reinvigorate Fatah, and that effort will have to be much, much bigger than Marwan. It has to be structural, not personality-based. And I'm really always very skeptical about knights in shining armor. We've seen them so many times in Palestinian and Israeli politics, and they always tend to burn out very quickly. The issue of national unity, government, and whether or not it's likely. I don't think national unity as such is at all possible in the short term. It simply requires Fatah and Hamas to move too far from their positions. Any government in which Hamas and Fatah sit we have to have a compromise platform, and I just don't see the two sides reaching that compromise platform. More likely what we will get is what they call a national accord government, whereby you have non-affiliated individuals who were selected by the two parties sitting there, therefore sitting in this cabinet, and therefore Hamas and Fatah don't really have to make the tough decisions and the tough moves in terms of their platforms. I think, though, this kind of arrangement is, by its very nature, very, very fragile, because it doesn't deal with the fundamental issues of this agreement, be it the security assets or be it the political platform. And I think it will be in many ways a repeat of the Mecca, the failed Mecca Accord. That said, this government, such a government, a national accord government, could be useful if it had two roles. And this actually corresponds to the other side of your question. The first role that this government has to have is the issue of holding elections. And this is where I'm actually most skeptical. I just don't see this happening anytime in the short term, simply because neither Fatah nor Hamas have an interest in doing that. Elections, the results are very unpredictable. Hamas is quite comfortable with governing Gaza at the time being. Fatah realizes that it's in a weak position right now, and if they go towards an election, they will lose, so they have no real interest in doing that. Anyways, they're firmly ensconced in the West Bank, so I don't see a political necessity driving it, nor do I see political benefit for either of the two parties. So I'm not terribly optimistic about the option of having an election. it does require, before we get to an election, it does require a political, how shall I say it, agreeing on the political rules of the game among the Palestinians, and this will take some of the heavy-handed measures that I think Nathan mentioned earlier. The other role of a national accord or a national unity government would be the issue of reconstruction of Gaza and the issue of how do you deal with the aid. And here again, I'm also quite pessimistic. I don't see aid moving beyond the humanitarian. In order to have real reconstruction and real development-oriented aid, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, you have to get the politics right. I cannot imagine the international community pumping in money into Gaza in a way that will strengthen Hamas until we have some sort of a national unity accord, until there is some sort of a sign-off on this, whether by the PA or, more importantly, I think, by some of the other Arab players who don't want to see Hamas terribly strengthened. So I'm not terribly optimistic. So if I were to predict, I would say we will have sometime soon maybe some sort of a national accord government with two mandates, election and reconstruction, and I think it will fail in both. And unless we deal with the fundamental disagreements between Hamas and Fatah, or one of the two parties wins and becomes a clear leader in Palestine, we're going to continue in this holding pattern that we've been seeing for a while.
It sounds like a competition of who could depress you more. Each answer gets worse. On the regional interference, not much to add to what Ghaith said. I would simply say that it's true that with Arafat's demise and with all the flaws he had, that one achievement has been compromised, not just because of involvement by Iran and Syria, but by many other actors as well, and I don't need to mention them. And that's really one of the huge losses that the Palestinians have endured. I'm going to spend most of my time on the talk of national unity government because I do think it is obviously at the center of people's preoccupations today. On the one hand, I do think there are factors that are pushing towards it. I think on Hamas's part, despite the boost they feel they got from the war in Gaza, they've also realized after Gaza their inability to get aid into the Strip in the absence of some form of reconciliation. I think they've also encountered a ceiling to their international outreach. I mean, the high point was the summit in Doha, but even that summit didn't attract as much participation as they had once hoped. And since then, I think they've seen, yes, they can get more meetings with Europeans, people are coming to Gaza more, but they won't break that ceiling, they believe, I think, without some change on the domestic scene. And as both Ghaith and Nathan said, there's popular pressure, particularly in Gaza, where, the further you get from Gaza, the more support there is for Hamas. In Gaza itself, our reporting indicates that there's quite a bit of dissatisfaction. People have lost a lot. They're not sure what the gain was. And Hamas feels that one way to get out of it is to form some kind of unity with Fatah and to get the aid in, both of which amount to the same. I think on Abu Mazen's part, there also is a realization. I'm not sure that he's ever experienced something quite like he experienced during the war in Gaza. The drop in his credibility. I assume it personally affected him, and I think it affects Fatah as well, which feels the need to respond to popular pressure to get back some form of unity. And Fatah in particular, which has no particular liking in Fayyad as prime minister, so they also have common cause in forming some kind of government in which he would not be prime minister. So I think that there's pressures that didn't exist on both Fatah and Hamas to come together. That said, I think, again, I would echo what Ghaith said, there are different versions of what unity could look like. At the upper end of the spectrum would be genuine reconciliation, national unity government that has a clear program, the security services would be reunified and professionalized, Gaza and the West Bank would be one entity once more, etc., and the PLO would be reformed. That's the high end. That's what they claim to be talking about. Beneath that would be a kind of national unity government that would at least bring Gaza and the West Bank together in some form. Then there's a third one, which I think is what Ghaith is talking about more, and which is what I think is the most realistic, which is a means of at least bringing the two sides together so that publicly they're together, which meets one of their criteria, so that there's a better way to get money into Gaza, which meets another one of their criteria, and to at least leave open the prospect of elections, though I'll come back to that later. I think that's a prospect that in some ways will meet everyone's immediate interest. It meets, as I said, Hamas and Fatah's. it might even be acceptable to the U.S. to come to the second part of your question, to the extent that I think the U.S. has three concerns about a national unity government. One is a political concern having to do with dealing with Hamas, which is a domestic political concern, which is a very real one. Second is what I would consider kind of ideological one, which was expressed to some extent by Gheit, the notion that if Hamas has to pay less of an entry ticket to international legitimacy, you're really dealing a crushing blow to the secular nationalist forces that we've assisted all this time. And third, which is an issue we haven't focused on perhaps enough, is their concern that whatever they've achieved in this West Bank first strategy, which we may feel is insufficient, they see two things. They see a security service in the West Bank that is much more effective, and the Israelis do as well, much more effective in combating Hamas and combating terrorism. And they see greater transparency in finances, greater accountability, both of which are the product of the government of Salam Fayyad. And I think those are three things that they would be hesitant to accept in a national unity government. So the only unity government they would accept is one that does the least damage to those three. So they would insist on some kind of platform that comes closer to Abbas's platform than Hamas's, even if it doesn't recite the catechism of the three conditions, but something that they could claim has moved Hamas, or Hamas not being in the government if you have a government of technocrats. On the political side, the U.S. would not deal with anyone affiliated with Hamas. It would be a bit like in the Lebanon case, where you deal with the government to the extent the government is not Hamas, but you issue those members with Hamas. And on the security point, and this is where I think Hamas, Fatah, and the U.S. may all agree, you enshrine the status quo. Hamas is in charge of Gaza for the time being, but the PA, as we now know it, is in charge of the West Bank. So you don't undo the Dayton Plan. You don't reform the security services. You don't truly change the parameters there. Now, it's hard to imagine any kind of unity government without releasing some of the Hamas detainees, and that will pose a problem for the U.S. and for Israel. So I'm not saying this is by any means a done deal, but I think if anything, if the pressures are right, we will move towards what I would call that de minimis form of unity, which is simply a government that can get aid into Gaza and that can be some kind of partner and give Abu Mazen a little more credibility and room when he negotiates with Israel. Now, that doesn't augur well for elections, because if the security services, number one, for the reasons that Gheit said, which I think are paramount, which is that neither side wants to gamble with its political fortunes, but also if you have Hamas in control of Gaza and the PA or whatever it is in control of the West Bank, neither side is really going to trust the other when it comes to organizing free and fair elections. So I echo what Gheit said. I'm not one who believes whatever the agreement that ultimately emerges says that you're going to see elections within the next year. So I could imagine an outcome as I just described it. The more time goes by, the less optimistic I'll be about that, and the more it will come to sound as just like the two-state solution. Everyone is in favor of it. You now have wall-to-wall consensus. It's quite extraordinary. The same people who were denouncing those of us who said that reconciliation was a must are now saying exactly the same thing, whether it's in Europe or other parts of the world, not quite yet in the U.S. But even the U.S. has said that reconciliation, and Mitchell has said reconciliation is important. So it may become one of those things that everyone says they want to do, but nobody actually achieves because the obstacles are too great and because they actually don't care as much as they profess to say. But for me, as I said earlier, I think the essentials of a unity government should be a ceasefire and some mechanism that would allow a genuine diplomatic process to take place and put in place a mechanism whereby if you reach an agreement, at least you have the capacity to bring it to a public referendum, although that obviously is a long-term proposition, and of course to help put Gaza back on its feet. It may not be the kind of reconstruction that it needed, but at least doing away with the worst of the humanitarian tragedy. I think those are at least realistic objectives, and I suspect that you ask what the U.S. reaction would be. I suspect that if this is a formula that Abbas and his people genuinely want, which was not the case in 2007, and a case in which some of his colleagues don't go around the world undermining the government that they just formed. If the Europeans are prepared to engage with that government, and from my recent trip in Europe at least, a number of officials in Europe say if there's a government formed on the same basis as Mecca, we will engage it, even if the U.S. doesn't, and we'll do as we do with Lebanon. We'll engage with all of them, and the U.S. will engage only with some. I think if the Obama administration is confronted with that reality, it would be very hard for it to say, well, we reject both Abbas's view and the rest of the international community's view. I think they'll be forced and perhaps will not be displeased with having to deal with that government in the ways that I described before.
Thanks, Rob. We have about 8 minutes left. There's unfortunately too many questions that we can get to. I will take a couple. Please, in the far back.
Yes, thank you. Keith Schultz with USAID. The dysfunctional nature of the political systems on both sides, Israeli and Palestinians, obviously are well documented and really, of course, contribute to either side making tough decisions that it has to make to achieve any sort of agreement. So on the Israeli side, I have a question. Do you think that the current sort of electoral system and the way that the Israeli political system is set up is actually deliberately designed to actually avoid the ability of an Israeli government to make the agreements on the that they would have to achieve an agreement? And on the Palestinian side, I thought I saw that Fatah was supposed to have its first sort of party congress in 20 years or 19 years this month. And the question on that is that because of internal pressures within Fatah to have some sort of congress? Is it domestic pressure that's forcing them, international pressure? And is this really just a showpiece, or is there really some serious ongoing discussions within Fatah to make some hard changes?
Thank you. Garrett, in the front, please.
Thank you. Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. And yesterday, Senator Kerry made a speech next door, a very spirited and I think thoughtful and, for a lot of people in the room, persuasive speech about his belief in there being a solution. I won't call it Plan A. It rested on four principles. The first is the emergence of Iran has unified the Middle East in a way that's new. Second, that the role of the Arab League in the peace process is hugely important. Third, that essentially the details of a final status are known. And fourth, that the Obama administration provides real opportunities for I'll use Joe Biden's term, for Russia reset, as witnessed by the appointment of Mitchell and sending the two people to Syria, et cetera. So my question is there, if you have read the speech or if you think about these 4 points, is there anything in what Senator Kerry said yesterday that would make you think differently about Plan B or your overall pessimism? And secondly, do you think he's got it wrong?
Thanks, Gary. I just wanted to add one brief question on to that, to pose it to all of you. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being Iran is an insurmountable obstacle to peace, and 1 being Iran is no obstacle to peace, where would you rank Iran? And why don't we go in reverse order now, and we'll give Nathan the last word.
I'll leave some of the questions to others, particularly on the party congress. I'll leave it to right then, Nathan. I want to focus on Senator Kerry's speech, which I did see. Listen, when I made my presentation about how we have to ask those questions, what's wrong with the peace process and with negotiations with the U.S., I mentioned that there's some things that need to be added to the mix. And John Kerry added a number of those things to the mix. He added what he called a regional strategy, the fact that the Arab League, the Arab world, has to be involved in this. One could go further and say that the Arabs and others need to be involved in setting up some kind of trusteeship, may be the wrong word, but really helping the Palestinians get on their feet as the Israelis withdraw, or as a condition for their withdrawal. So as I said, I think those are the elements that we have to think about before jumping. I wouldn't call it Plan A because it's not been Plan A, but I think we need to call it whatever else and add this to the mix. I don't think it's quite enough. I'm not sure that we can still say we know what the solution is, although I've said that so many times that it's coming out of my ears. But I think we have to think about how, if we know what the solution is, and all the parties agree on it, it hasn't occurred, I think we at least have to raise the question, do we really know it, and is it a solution that is truly acceptable politically to both sides? So I think that's one question. We may have to tinker with or modify that solution somewhat. I'm a little more skeptical about looking at the prism of, and this comes a little bit to Karim's question, looking at the prism of the Arab-Israeli conflict through through an Iranian prism. I think that's often been a mistake. I don't think it's to our benefit to think that the whole region, even though they may talk about Iran, that they're prepared to align themselves in ways with Israel in opposition to Iran. I think they will find that that's a very delicate dance to play vis-a-vis their own public opinion. And I think it will only carry us so far. And I also think that the more you polarize the region against Iran, the harder it is for certain entities, Syria, Hamas, or Hezbollah, to play more productive games. So I would be a strong advocate for engaging Syria and Iran simultaneously as a way of, in a way, neutralizing the negative impact that either one might choose to have. I would add in this list of if we want to end on a more optimistic note, I think the prospects of an Israeli-Syrian deal are certainly more encouraging than they are for an Israeli-Palestinian deal, but I think that in some ways one could help as a lever for the other. I think it's going to be very hard for Syria to reach a deal if the Palestinian track is completely comatose. I think for political reasons, for domestic legitimacy reasons, for their own image in the Arab world, they're going to insist that there be some movement on the Palestinian side. They could exercise influence on Hamas in that respect, and in fact, you may find a more virtuous circle than what we've seen in the past. I don't think an Israeli-Syrian deal is a done thing by any means, but I think those are the kinds of things that if I were advising the administration, I'd say you could work on sort of on the margins, Palestinian reconciliation, reaching out to Syria, restarting Syrian-Israeli negotiations, reaching out to Iran. I think by changing that landscape, you may do more to help move towards a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than by focusing on a two-state solution right now. Iran on a 1 to 10 scale, as I said, I think it's more a matter of regional mood than it is about Iran's immediate and concrete impact. I think you could have a peace deal even if Iran is not prepared to acquiesce in it. And as I said, I would warn against turning, as a colleague of mine recently said, an Iraq-centric Middle East policy into Iran-centric Middle East policy. I think we do much better by having a more holistic view of the region.
That sounds like a 2.5 out of 10.
Okay.
Faith, and then Nathan. We just have a few minutes, so if you want to just take the juiciest question to you.
Okay, well, they're all juicy. They're all two of them. So on the Israeli political system, I think it's not designed deliberately to avoid reaching a deal. I think it reflects some of the complexities in Israel itself as a society and as a polity. And I don't believe there's any way in the short term to change the Israeli political system. The country is too diverse and too much of a mosaic to create a more stable political system. So we have to deal with what we have right now. Fatah conference. I mean, I started working with the Palestinians in 1998, and every year I was told that the conference is going to happen next summer. This year it's going to happen next spring. So that's a development. The conference cannot happen absent more systematic work towards reconstructing Fatah. If a conference were to happen in the current conditions, it will have to be one of two things. Either it's going to have to be doctored and really kind of just a staged piece, or it will end up with creating an implosion in Fatah because of many other issues. I mean, because of many issues, be it the old guard giving up position, their strength and position, while at the same time they continue to maintain control over money and weapons and other tools of patronage within Fatah. There are many things that make it quite impractical right now to fully reform Fatah. And I think there is a lot of pressure now to have a conference. We might even have one soon. But I don't think it's going to be one that will create any fundamental changes. I think what needs to be done in terms of Fatah is, rather than thinking of how do we make Fatah into a perfect political party, which I think is impossible until there's a Palestinian state, how do you make Fatah into the objective should be how to make Fatah again into something that can function, something that can at least give us a minimum degree of stability, to recreate Fatah as an anchor in a political system, as opposed to trying to really move beyond that to create a progressive political party. I haven't heard Senator Kerry's speech, so I can't really respond directly to it, but just a few thoughts. Iran unified the Middle East. My enemy's enemy is not always my friend. It's more complicated than that. I just don't see some of the Arab countries working with Israel vis-a-vis Iran, even though they might want to in certain things, because the political cost, and I think Rob mentioned that earlier, the political cost is too much. If there's an Arab or the Palestinian-Israeli deal, then it might become easier for Arabs to deal with Israel vis-a-vis Iran and trying to control Iran. But as again Rob said, Iran is it's a very nuanced, textured issue, and I don't think that some of the countries, even in the Gulf, which see Iran as a threat, necessarily want to have too much of a confrontational approach to Iran. I think they want to have a more subtle policy. Arab League role. Absolutely important as long as the Arab League avoids paralysis. Usually Arab League works with the lowest common denominator, and with the division that we see among Arabs right now, this is a recipe for paralysis. I think, though, we can definitely use some like-minded Arab countries using the Arab Peace Initiative to create more of an incentive package for a peace deal. The really new element, though, which I think is most important, is the issue of the Obama administration. And I think that the honeymoon, the kind of impact that the Obama administration brings in, is still, the honeymoon is still there. I think we have an opening right now to shape policy. Whatever policy that the Obama administration takes right now will define how we're going to be dealing with issues in the next 8 years. And I think there is a hunger in the region for an active American role, an active American engagement after 8 years of either hands off or a very ideologically, or as Rob put it, faith-based policy. There's a sense of being re-energized because we finally we're dealing with a realist approach to foreign policy. We might like it, we might not like it, but at least we can deal with it. And I think this is, again, where Nathan's paper is really important, in that this debate is important right now. What the administration decides at this stage will color what it's going to be doing at least in the next 4 years. And they have to get it right, and they have to explore all of the options and all of the challenges to the orthodoxy.
Thanks, great. Nathan.
Okay, just very briefly, I'm not going to respond to everything, but first one quick modification of something I said earlier, that the Secretary of State slammed the door on a national unity government. I still think that's true, but she did not slam the door on what Keith refers to, as the Palestinians referred to, as a national accord government, or what Rob mentioned as a technocratic government. That door is still ajar. At least as I read official statements. Second, real quickly, Israeli political system. One thing I just would point out, yes, it appears dysfunctional right now, but since the demise of sort of the one-party Labor Party dominance, Israel has produced, to my mind, at least 3 prime ministers who acted coherently on behalf of the strategic vision in ways that really transformed the environment: Begin, Rabin, and Sharon. Whether for better or worse. So it is capable of producing those kinds of leaders. I think that this situation right now is a problem. Fatah Congress, I don't have of much to add. I would probably have given the same sort of smart alecky remark that I did about Marwan Barghouti. That's a great idea. That would have been actually something for the United States to have concentrated on in 2006. At this point, it probably won't do any harm, but it's certainly not a panacea. And in terms of Kerry's speech, again, I have nothing to add. My general attitude would be the same. I actually probably saw it a little bit closer to Plan A than Rob implied. The focus on the regional dimension is very, very welcome, and regional diplomacy is very, very welcome. The Iran-centric was driven a little bit too far in the text of the speech. Whether that's just because, in American politics, Iran is bad, and therefore you can. You can probably make your speech resonate a little bit better the more you dump on Iran, perhaps. But the only other thing that I would have to add to that answer is a number to Kareem's question. And before Rob had spoken, I wrote down 3. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Nathan. I expect your next piece to be entitled Palestinian Israeli Chicken Soup for the Soul, so you can kind of uplift us a bit. But thank you all for coming, and please join me in welcoming.